Because you know, so much of our waste and rubbish is simply thrown into a landfill. What do you think's happened to all of your toothbrushes? It's left just basically to rot, and yet so many of our landfills are full. They can't take any more rubbish. That means that sometimes people end up dumping rubbish in other areas, sometimes just open pieces of land around our country. Also, some claims that our landfill space could be managed more effectively. Kate Stubbs is the marketing director at Interwaste. Kate, good afternoon to you. You suggest there are better ways to manage this waste. How can we change the way we manage it?
Most definitely. At the moment in South Africa, we create about 122 million tons of waste a year. And most of that, if we're lucky, ends up in a landfill. But we do have a large and growing problem of illegal disposal too, which is creating additional, impacts on the environment in terms of pollution of our airways and our waterways. So from a waste management perspective, we need to really rethink waste and rather try to look at waste as a resource rather than just something that has no value. And that starts right from awareness and education to what we call separation at source. The sooner in the cycle we can separate our waste, the more value it has. So that's why recycling is so important, and you can start in your homes at just separating even your dry and your wet waste. But from a company perspective too is actually managing your waste more effectively right from when it's created, rather than putting it all in one dustbin, mixing it all together. You're generally contaminating it, and then you're disposing it to landfill. I mean, the ideal though is to not create waste at all, but let's start with at least managing our waste more effectively.
At 120 or was it 122 million tons of waste that we're producing every year, is that amount going up or is it staying roughly the same?
Yeah, it's rising, and it's rising globally. I mean, waste is not only a problem in South Africa, it's a global problem, and it typically tracks population growth. So the more people there are, the more waste there is. On average, each individual human, I mean, depending on economic circumstances, but creates about 1.5 to 2 kilos of waste a day. That's a global average. So the more people we have, the more waste we have. And it also tracks economic development, but it's typically very much aligned to population growth. So yeah, we keep making and creating more waste. And if we're not changing our behavior, this pile of waste is just growing and growing and growing. And that we really need systemic change in order to create the systems and processes for beneficiating our waste. And there are lots of opportunities to do so, but it does take quite a radical change of mindset and then the support structures to enable that sort of beneficiation of waste.
So some things I know are easy to recycle. I know this pen's relatively easy to recycle. It's made of plastic. So many people claim that their product is made out of recycled plastic. I'm a little cynical about some of that, Kate, I won't lie. There are some things that you cannot recycle, so tissues, for example. So what happens to that? We are still going to need landfills, I'm presuming. Are we always going to need some kind of landfill to store our rubbish?
Yes, I think landfills are here to stay. And, our regulation in South Africa is relatively new in terms of waste, but it has very stringent requirements in terms of even constructing a landfill now. Most of our landfills that we have currently in South Africa, you can just call dump sites, because there was no regulation at the time they were created. They literally are spaces where waste is dumped. But the new regulation has very stringent rules about how you engineer a landfill. It's got really strong layers or base layers that protect any type of seepage or leakage into the ground, and it requires a long environmental assessment process and a large investment. So landfills going forward are still going to be part of the system. They are globally anyway, even in first world countries where recycling rates and waste legislation is far more advanced than us. Landfills still exist, and maybe this is a bit too forward thinking, but landfills, certainly engineered landfills, should be seen as storage space for the future world, because there are a lot of resources that are going into landfills right now that could be remined for future use. And that's already actually happening in Europe. Closed landfills are being mined to extract materials for secondary resources. But I think the message is clear that landfills are here to stay, but they are, because certain types of beneficiation, certain types of waste are still very costly. So there are technologies that can process a lot of different types of waste, but they also need to be sustainable and commercially viable. And so, we continue to explore new technology, specifically in South Africa. There are lots of opportunities for that, but making sure they're commercially viable and sustainable is a little bit more complex and takes a bit more time.
One of the countries that's been able to sort of, been one of the leaders in recycling and changing people's behavior is Germany. But it took quite a long time. You need a sort of social action. Are the reasons why it happened in Germany and not in other places. In Australia, I think eventually you get fined if you don't separate your rubbish at source. It's quite a lot of work. I mean, you actually have to change the habits of a very large number of people for quite a long time for that behavior to take hold. Do we need that kind of social effort here?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're also seen as one of the laziest nations with regards to waste. But I actually lived in Germany many, many years ago, and I was terrified managing my waste because there were strict rules and strict structures, and everyone was watching you. But that's what you require. So the one thing is education and awareness. And I think a lot of South Africans are there. From across the board, people see value in waste. But what we lack is the infrastructure and the system to support that process. So in Germany, on any given day, I knew it was a metal day, organic day, a glass day. I knew exactly what was happening and where to put my waste and that it would be collected. So they made it really easy for you. We're nowhere near there, but we do have a lot of people recycling at home, a lot of small businesses being created. We have a large informal sector that are making their livelihood out of waste collection. But what we really need is, in a step change of that, is a proper sort of public-private partnerships and systems to really assist the informal sector in collecting waste and our households. In order to collect it and get those economies of scale and then to invest in beneficiation. Recycling, a lot of the materials that we recycled in South Africa and globally used to go to China. So a lot of the plastics and the papers and the metals went to China. But China put a ban on importing waste materials, and that put a lot of pressure globally on the recycling market. And we really need to, whatever waste we're creating in our country, we need to look to collect and beneficiate in country. That creates jobs and opportunities, but it does require quite a lot of a collective effort and a bit of a systemic change.
There's some things that I think are always going to use a certain amount of plastic or or will for the foreseeable future, certain things. So, for example, I used the example of my pen earlier. I quite like my pen. I don't know why, but it's got a certain shape. I know it's going to work most of the time. It's quite hard. Can use it to do all sorts of things with it. But there's a huge amount of packaging that involves a lot of plastic. And I often wonder to myself, when I'm opening the third, whatever it is, to get to my braai meat on a Sunday, do I really need to have this much packaging around this product?
Yeah, plastic specifically has a lot of focus because it doesn't biodegrade and it stays in the environment for thousands and thousands of years and actually breaks down into the little microplastics, which are have long-term health impacts for all sorts of our systems, including us as humans. They're even finding microplastics in our organs now. But plastic has a huge value to play too, in that it preserves products, it's lightweight, it makes things very cost-effective. But we are having changes in our regulation, the extended producer responsibility regulation, which was promulgated about 2 years ago, which is putting much more onus on producers of items and products to look at their packaging waste and not only take responsibility for their product, but also their packaging of that product to end use. So it used to just go back up to consumers, and then that was a consumer's problem, where producers are now having to take responsibility for their products and packaging post-consumer use. And those type of regulations are starting to force some change in the market. But it's also us as consumers. We're very used to getting our veggies or our meat, as you say, beautifully packaged, all looking perfect. We have beautiful vegetables, beautiful that, and we have to change our mindset. It's also in buying product without all that packaging. So it's both ways. We have regulation changing behavior and forcing some innovation as well, which is great. But as consumers, we also need to adapt our behavior to not buying product which is so heavily packaged. But I agree with you. I mean, my weekly shop, by the time I've unpacked everything, I have a whole dustbin full of packaging material that you have to ask yourself, is that necessary?
Kate Stubbs, thank you, Marketing Director at Interwaste. Do appreciate the time.